Hi everyone, welcome back to our Ancient Persia video lecture series. Today's topic is Persian rule in Egypt, where we've got wonderful documentary evidence from the second half of the 400s BCE. The narrative sources tend to treat Persia's interaction with different regions of the empire when those regions rise up, when they engage in revolt, when there's some kind of military or diplomatic event that touches on them. We've seen Egypt under Persian rule before in the context of revolts against that Persian rule. But our documentary sources in some ways are more valuable. They're primary sources, and they give us a more complex view of what life is like and what the experiences of empire are like in this crucial Persian province. Egypt, of course, has its own unique conditions, but at the same time, it gives us a lot of evidence on how the Persians can operate a provincial system, and some of the conditions that are seen in Egypt may also be at work in other parts of the empire. So what we're going to do today is focus on a group of documents that I hope you've had time to read on Scholar, or you will read in the near future. These are known as the contents of the Arshama archive, a group of letters connecting to the personal affairs of Egypt's satrap in the second half of the 5th century BC. We'll also think a little bit about a petition from a Jewish community in southern Egypt that brings to light some of the complexities of inter-subject relations and local administration. Now, Prince Arshama is a fascinating character. He is mentioned briefly in some of our narrative sources. We know that he helped King Darius II come to power at the end of the reign of Artaxerxes I. We know that Arshama is the ruler or the satrap of Persian Egypt for almost half a century in the second half of the 400s BCE. He may be put in place shortly after the revolt of Inaros in the 450s, and he's still alive as late as 402 or 401 BCE. We know that he had land holdings. He had personal estates and household properties both in Egypt and also in Babylon. And the documents of the archive connected with him show him as an absentee satrap. Most of the documents, when they give any hint of his location, suggest that he is actually in Babylon or Susa at the royal court, corresponding with deputies who are trying to run the province of Egypt 1,000 miles away in his absence. We know that Arshama is an Achaemenid, that not only in membership in the empire, but he is part of the extended royal family. And in fact, we know we can think of him as Arshama II. He is the grandson of an Arshama I, a son of Darius the Great and Cyrus's daughter Artistone. And Arshama, in fact, the satrap of Egypt, inherits his grandfather's seal, which remarkably has turned up on tablets from the Persepolis fortification archive from about 500 BC, and then on a piece of clay attached to one of the Egyptian satrap Arshama's letters in the late 400s BC. So it shows some of the continuity, not just in the royal family of kings, but also in the outer branches of the royal family. And you might have powers passed down from one generation to the next. Now, the Arshama archive it's a fascinating connection of letters. You'll find out more information about it in John Ma's introduction to the coming publication and scholarly commentary on the Arshama archives. It's a small group of letters. They're written in Aramaic script, but there are also writings on the bottom indicating that other copies were made in Demotic Egyptian, and showing the bilingual nature of Achaemenid administration in Egypt. They're written on strips of leather. They miraculously survived. They were obtained under shady circumstances by a German archaeologist in the early 20th century, along with a leather envelope or satchel that may have held some of the letters. Eventually, in the 1930s, they made their way into the Bodleian Library in Oxford, where they can be found to this day. They illustrate the satrap's correspondence about some of the details of running the province of Egypt, but they also focus primarily on the satrap's personal fortune. And they suggest that while someone like Arshama is an imperial administrator, he is deeply interested in his own personal household resources. How will he profit from this position of empire? One article that is to be published in the forthcoming collection on the Arshama archives by John Ma, one of the editors of the archive, refers to him provocatively as Arshama the Vampire, as someone whose career in these letters can exemplify the exploitative nature of imperial control and profit at the expense of the empire's subjects. So I want you to read through the letters. They're fascinating glimpses into the empire. They provide a lot of anecdotal detail. But there are a few particular trends and facets of the letters that I'd like you to pay attention to. One is to think about how Arshama corresponds, how he talks with other Achaemenid officials. Several of the letters are written to either civic deputies in Egypt or in some cases apparently to military commanders. And there's a lot of reference to the continuation of unrest in parts of Egypt, probably especially concentrated in the Nile Delta in the far north. The Greek historians tend to view Egypt through the lens of the Delta, and that seems to be where a lot of the anti-Persian rebellions, such as Inaros's uprising, are concentrated. By Arshama's governorship as satrap, the large rebellions have been put down, but there are still pockets of resistance. There are references in the letters to turbulence and unrest, and to ongoing operations by probably small Persian forces trying to recapture estates or forts where the rebels are in control. In one of these texts, Arshama shows a particular interest in the fate of some of his own personal Kurtash workers. He mentions that 13 Kurtash, identified by their ethnic label as people from Cilicia in southeastern Anatolia, have been separated from their work at his estate. Apparently they've found their way into possession of the rebels. It's unclear if they've run away, if they have voluntarily run off to the rebels. But the satrap is corresponding with a official who's apparently overseeing anti-rebel operations. And his priority is to give a number, to give the names of these individuals, and to ensure that they are not harmed, that when they come back into Persian possession, they are brought back to Arshama's estate. Again, the interest here seems to be making sure that the satrap's personal property, in the form of these workers, goes untouched and is restored to him. Another fascinating letter involves the satrap's interaction with and work through his Egyptian estate manager. While the satrap is out of the country, Arshama's estates are run by ethnic Egyptian officials who are part of an Egyptian class who are trying to cooperate with the Persian regime for their own social benefit. This particular official, named Samshek, is attested in several of the letters of Arshama. And in one letter that's especially interesting, Arshama is writing to a military officer named Armapia, who has apparently refused to take orders from the satrap's Egyptian servant. In other words, we may see here some conflict between the private and public natures of Persian administration. You have a military figure who is being ordered by someone who comes from the local Persian subject group, and someone who is associated with the satrap's personal property. When he learns that Armapia is not taking or not following the order from Psamshek, the satrap writes Armapia a personal directive ordering him to do whatever my estate agent tells you, and threatening that if you do not cooperate and follow Psamshek's orders to the letter, you will be subject to severe investigation and presumable punishment. So the satrap's personal household affairs can blend with and overlap with, and probably for Arshama's point of view, can be more important than the local interests of officials who are not necessarily tied to his household. Now, the most interesting of the texts that deal with Arshama's household and his Egyptian stewards deal with his next estate manager, an Egyptian named Nacht-Hor, who shows up in several of the letters. In one letter, we see that Nacht-Hor is traveling from the Susa region back to Egypt. Presumably he's visited the satrap there. He's being sent back to Egypt on the satrap's personal affairs. And we have his travel authorization document, the only such document that actually survives from the Royal Road system. It's useful. It gives a list of stops along the way that allows us to trace his itinerary. It labels key stopover points and Persian officials. But above all, it includes instructions that Nacht-Hor and his travel companions are not allowed to stay over for more than one day at any particular site. And it tells storehouse officials who are issuing them supplies on their 1,000-mile journey, don't pay them if they stay for an extra day. In other words, don't let my workers dawdle. Keep them on task. Keep them moving. Don't let them get any extra enjoyment on the side out of this journey. They need to be focused entirely on the satrap's business. When Nacht-Hor gets back to Egypt, he has all sorts of issues to deal with. And his relationship with Arshama is best summed up in the reprimand letter that Arshama sends him, comparing him unfavorably with his predecessor. This is a wonderful text for the social dynamics of Achaemenid power. You should read it closely. The gist is that Psamshek, the previous estate manager, is held up as doing a better job than Nacht-Hor is doing now. The guy who had your job before did a much better job than you, Nacht-Hor. You need to get on task. Arshama is angry in this letter because his estate is not profiting in a time of domestic unrest. And he points out that other Persian landowners in Egypt and their Egyptian estate managers, and Psamshek, back when he had your job, Nacht-Hor, they knew what to do when there was trouble in the land. You go out into the countryside, you abduct people, you mark them with my mark. That is a reference to branding abducted workers. You put them to work on my estates so that my property grows. My property is not currently growing, so we have a problem. The idea is that Arshama, the world's scariest boss, is telling Nacht-Hor in no uncertain terms, you're going to be investigated and punished. You are not going to have this position any longer unless you use this unrest, as your predecessor did, to make me richer. Again, this gets at the bottom line of elite social power in the Persian Empire, as many other historical empires. The personal enrichment of officials goes hand in hand with or outstrips their interest in more public duties. The question might be asked here, is it to the satrap's advantage to completely suppress revolt? Or is it okay that we have pockets of unrest and violence in the countryside? Does that give a cover for Persian landowners in this provincial area to build their own wealth and to profit from the broader conditions in the imperial system? Now, there are other aspects of the Arshama archives that also shed really interesting light on Persian behavior in Egypt. Another really useful letters, a famous letter involving the repair of a boat in southern Egypt at the Persian fortress of Elephantini. This is basically the border fort at the southern boundary of Egypt near the first cataract of the Nile, near modern Luxor. Elephantini holds a Persian military garrison, probably several thousand individuals supported by farms and estates on an island in the Nile River and in the surrounding neighborhood on the banks of the Nile. And in this particular letter, someone who is apparently in Persian employ has a Nile River boat. It may be involved in tax collection, in toll collection on the Nile, or local security patrols, but the boat needs repairs. So the captain comes to his fortress officials. He reports that his boat needs repairs, and we get this remarkable document then generated showing the letters of red tape or red clay involved in Persian provincial bureaucracy. This one boat being repaired 550 miles south of Egypt's provincial capital generates a report with the fortress commander, who has to write the satrap, who has to authorize inspectors to make sure that the boat genuinely needs the repairs that it does. They have to send carpenters to inspect it. Then they have to authorize the release of supplies, including timber, nails, sulfur, arsenic, various other supplies used in protecting and recoating the hull. All of this is done apparently in duplicate copies, both in Aramaic and in Demotic Egyptian, although again we just have the Aramaic version. All of this for one boat. And it's, again, a fascinating insight into the multiple layers of bureaucracy that characterized every operation within the Achaemenid provincial system. Now finally, we have another document that I want to pay attention to, I want you to think about. This is the so-called Elephantini Temple Petition, which also concerns goings-on during Arshama's term as satrap in the fortress town of Elephantini in the far south of Egypt. Among the garrison in the Elephantini fort, there are multiple ethnic groups and multiple faiths represented. And Elephantini is particularly fascinating because it's left behind a large number of papyrus letters. These are separate from the Arshama archive. They form their own group of Elephantini archives. And most of them connect with the business affairs and personal relationships and marriage contracts and business contracts of a Jewish immigrant community that makes up part of the Persian military garrison. Apparently a group of Judeans had traveled down into Egypt to go into Egyptian military service in the 600s BCE, before the Persian Empire came. And they stayed in Persian service after the Persian takeover of Egypt. They're attested at Elephantini down as late as the 390s BCE. So the Jews at Elephantini are serving alongside non-Jewish people from various imperial populations. They own land, they have a community within the fortress, and they have built their own temple where they worship the Jewish god Yahweh. Now, this temple would be regarded as illegitimate by Jewish temple authorities in the city of Jerusalem, in Judea itself. Basically, you have a diaspora branch of Judaism here that's developed its own traditions for worshiping God, that's trying to follow the Jewish tradition. We actually have a document that shows Passover regulations for the Jewish garrison, which actually get approved by the Persian authorities all the way up to King Darius II. But at Jerusalem in the 5th century, as you saw in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the temple community has been rebuilt, and the actual temple as the center of Judaism has been restored with Persian official support. Now in Judea, there's a high priest who oversees the Jewish community in Jerusalem. There's also a civic governor who might be ethnically Judean at some times, but who is part of the Persian administrative system and answers up to the satrap of Persia's beyond the Euphrates River province. Now, basically, the Jewish temple authorities in Jerusalem would want nothing to do with a separate temple organization in some other part of the empire, although they are united in some cultural sense by their Jewish tradition. Now, in Elephantini, what happens is the Jewish temple community there gets in a dispute with local Egyptians who are also in Persian service. There's a land dispute between the Jewish temple at Elephantini and an Egyptian temple which is located across the street. The Egyptian temple worships the god Khnum, a popular god in southern Egypt who's depicted with the body of a man and the head of a ram. The Jewish temple sacrifices rams on a regular basis to the Hebrew god Yahweh, according with Jewish tradition, and this, as well as other tensions between the local Egyptian and Jewish communities, build up into outright violence in the late 400s BCE. At some point in an escalating dispute between this Egyptian temple and this Jewish temple, the Egyptian temple authorities seem to have gone to the Persian fortress commander and to a local district governor who is a deputy of the satrap. And they get their support, they get their permission to attack, loot, and tear down the Jewish temple on Elephantini Island. In return, Jewish authorities within the garrison community wrote to Persian officials to try to get justice and permission to get the temple back. They asked for punishment of the local Egyptians and the local Persian officials who they allege were bribed by their Egyptian rivals. They seem to have written to Arshama, who was not in Egypt at the time, but we don't have their direct correspondence with the satrap. What we have are very interesting. We have a letter from the Jewish community at Elephantini to the civic governor of Judea up at Jerusalem. They say that the satrap isn't aware of what's happening. Arshama is out of the loop. And they say that the high priest at Jerusalem has not answered their letters. They also say they've been writing to the Samaritans, to the Persian governor of Samaria. And basically, they're writing to Persian district officials outside the province of Egypt to try to get them to use their influence with the satrap of Egypt to bring about a compromise that would help the Elephantini Jewish community. Eventually, this seems to have been successful. After several years of petitioning, the Jews at Elephantini finally got a satrapal response. And the satrap, Arshama, allowed them to rebuild their temple, but seems to have stopped animal sacrifices there, maybe in a compromise with the local Egyptian community. So again, this is an insight into the complexity of Persian rule on their Egyptian frontier.